I want to greatly welcome you. My name is Maria Hlavev. I'm Artistic Director of BAK, Basis for Actuele Kunst. And we gather on this remarkable occasion when Boris Groys is going to give us a talk related to the exhibition that he curated at BAK with the work of Alexandre Kojève. I think Boris Groys does not need to be introduced. One of the most brilliant minds, I dare to say, in our field and in our time. Somebody who's been extraordinarily generous in welcoming us to his knowledge through numerous writings, publications, but also his work with BAK, specifically as a research advisor for our long-term project, Former West. I wanted to, with just a couple of words, introduce how we actually got to this project, which I dare to say is a remarkable discovery of Alexandre Kojève as photographer. The long-term research exhibition, publication and education project Former West is located in the global planetary changes that the year 1989 brought about. And thus, one of the seminal readings we looked at was, of course, naturally, Francis Fukuyama and his essay, The End of History, published in 1989 and later enlarged into a book publication in 1992. Francis Fukuyama regularly recalls Alexandre Kojève, but does not quite quote. And that was quite important reason why we needed to start looking at Alexandre Kojève. And it was precisely Boris Groys who came to us at some point announcing that a private archive of Alexandre Kojève was just donated to the National Library in France. And he insisted I go there to study. So we made complex arrangements to send Boris Groys there to study. And I think first day, maybe second day of his residency, he phoned back saying, Maria, you have to come over. It's amazing. And it is amazing. It's an amazing discovery that I think helps us understand much more, not only about Alexandre Kojève, not only about the concept of post-histoire, but also explains or helps us understand contemporary art in a different way. I will offer the floor to Boris in just a second. I, however, would like to say a couple of words about what is it that's happening at this country in this moment. On Monday, Raad voor Cultuur, advising State Secretary of Culture, issued an advice with which a huge portion of this art world disappears. That's tragic. BAK was considered as one of 6 most important so-called presentatieinstellingen in the Netherlands. It did receive subsidy. However, it's 60% less than what we have had thus far. An argument for this is that the BAK privileges discourse to aesthetically inspiring exhibitions. Now, it's very hard to explain to a committee like that privileging discourse does not necessarily mean underprivileging exhibitions. I think this is what we very seriously take care of. I was thinking what to do in this kind of situation 3 days after the advice was issued, and I originally thought, I didn't share it with you, Boris, that I would simply ask you to deliver just 40% of your lecture. But then I thought that would be stupid, because a council that can issue such an advice is either lacking knowledge or confidence and trust in what has contemporary art become in the course of the last 20 years. Trying to think in terms, or continue thinking in terms of art equals art market, art equals beautiful exhibitions, and actually lagging behind in understanding that the change is, that the world is changing just before our eyes. So I thought the remedy is to offer even more discourse and even more visually inspiring exhibitions. And that's something I trust we have to offer. Boris, the floor is yours. And something very important, thank you, Gwen. After the talk, we just want to invite you to back for a drink. Boris.
Thank you, Maria. I'm very glad to be here. Yeah, okay. So now, no? Now you cannot hear me? Or you can? Yeah, okay. Good. So you can hear me, and I am glad to be here, and really this exhibition could be made only before I, in my research, and the whole project was so generously supported by Maria, and because of the work of the team on the back. It was a wonderful cooperation that I really enjoyed. And thank you for your introduction. I will indeed be speaking about Kojève because I had an impression being here and answering some questions that Kojève maybe is not so much known in Holland. Maybe it's my mistake, but I had this feeling. He is in fact not so very much known in general outside of France. In France, he's a big star, intellectual star, and I think people who were involved into reading of French philosophy know him better, but he's not very much known for the general public. So I think I will not be speaking about specifically his photographs, but more about his life and his thinking and his importance for the history of European philosophy. And then at the end, I will come back to the images that you will be able to see after my presentation. So during the last few decades, we have been time and again confronted with discourse on the end of history, end of subjectivity, end of art, death of man, and especially death of the author, on the impossibility of creativity as a new in today's culture. The discourse has its origin in the course of lectures on Hegel's phenomenology of spirit that was given by Alexandre Kojève at the École des Études in Paris between the years 1933 and 1939. This course was regularly attended by leading figures of French intellectual life of that time, including Georges Bataille, Jacques Lacan, André Breton, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and Raymond Aron. The transcripts of Kojève's lectures circulated in Parisian intellectual circles and were widely read there, especially productively by Sartre and Camus. This course is known under the simple title Séminaire, acquired a semi-mythical status in France at that time, which they kept there almost until our own days. Lacan later called the course of lectures he started after Kojève's death, also Séminaire. Of course, apocalyptic discourse on the impending end of history is not new. But Kojève asserted that the end of history does not wait for us in the future, as it was usually thought. Rather, the end of history has already taken place in the past, namely already in the 19th century, as it was certified by Hegelian philosophy. According to Kojève, we have already been living for a pretty long time after the end of history, under the post-historical condition, we would say now the postmodern condition, but we are simply not fully aware of these conditions yet. This transfer of the end of history from the future into the past was something new at that time that Kojève tried to make it plausible to his audience. Maybe that is why he also attempted to illustrate and corroborate his theoretical discourse with the example of his own practice of writing. Indeed, Kojève pretended never to offer to his audience anything personal, anything subjective, anything that comes from his own philosophical standpoint. Actually, he even asserted that he doesn't have a philosophical standpoint at all, but only repeats in a different context, in French context, Hegelian phenomenology. He also never published anything during his life, even if he was time and again writing pretty long philosophical texts and very interesting texts that are now published once after another in the recent years. But they were for a long time unknown. And his masterpiece, Introduction à la lecture de Hegel, that actually made his name, was published after the war by Raymond Queneau, a surrealist writer, and one of his students. So, in a certain way, he also tried to prove by his own intellectual career that he's somebody that already lives beyond history. After the war, Kojève explicitly ended his philosophical teaching and writing and became one of the creators of contemporary European Union. He worked out an agreement on tariffs that remained until today one of the pillars of the European economic system, as a High Commissioner, French High Commissioner, representative of de Gaulle originally in Brussels. Kojève died from a heart attack during a meeting of the European Commission in 1968. That's interesting and characteristic year, of course, and it's a very characteristic death. There is, in fact, even a tape of this lecture that he gave. At a certain point in time, you can hear this, and he dies at this moment. So one can say that Kojève is a kind of Arthur Rimbaud of modern European bureaucracy, a philosophical writer who decided that philosophy is over, like Rimbaud decided that poetry is over, or was over, but he didn't go to Africa. He went to Brussels with more or less same effect. Today, discourse of post-historicity and postmodernity has become ubiquitous, but we still have no single example of this radical attitude in philosophical writing. We know that kind of use of the ready-made through Duchamp or maybe Warhol. We know Borges' essays and tales, and especially the tale on Pierre Menard, a writer that repeats Cervantes' Don Quixote, but all the philosophers, also French philosophers, that wrote about the death of subject and end of originality, including Deleuze, Derrida, and many others, never asserted that their own writing was unoriginal and non-subjective. So we find that claim only in Kojève. The clue to this claim of unoriginality can be found in a dissertation of the work of Vladimir Solovyov that Kojève had written in German at the University of Heidelberg in 1926 with the title Die religiöse Philosophie Vladimir Solovyovs, under his original name, Alexandre Kojève. In fact, Alexandre Kojève is of Russian origin, and he emigrated in 1919. He was born in a very rich family that had some kind of diamond, I don't know, stalls. Yeah? And he tried to sell a diamond on the black market in 1919. He was seized by police, convicted to death, and waited for two days to be executed, but then released through the intervention of influential friends and relatives. One of these influential friends was, of course, his uncle, the painter Kandinsky. He comes with the same family, and he was at the time, this time, head of the whole museum system of the Soviet Russia. So after he was released, he emigrated to Germany, and he began to study philosophy there under Karl Jaspers at the Heidelberg University. He met Husserl, he met Heidegger, and he got his degree with Jaspers in 1934. So he had this Russian-German background before, phenomenological background, before leaving to France in an also important year, 1933. So it's obvious, yeah, why he immigrated now from Germany. Now, what's interesting about Solovyov that he wrote about, he was very famous in Russia, but almost not known in the West, a philosopher at the end of the 19th century, who in a very strange way sexualized philosophy. He believed that the philosophy is a kind of desire for Sophia. If you read Solovyov writings at the end of the 19th century, you remember, if you already had this background, the figure of Derrida of phallogocentrism. So a kind of association between these two fundamental gestures. One is philosophical gesture, coming into the core of the truth, yeah, coming into the place in which truth can be found, and of course, the sexual act. So he actually believed that philosophical desire, so desire for Sophia, and sexuality have the same source of energy. He also believed, I mean, Solovyov, that Sophia, so divine wisdom, was actually in love with him and visited him 3 times. One time in library, one time in his home, and one time in Egypt, as he looked at the pyramids. And he describes this experience in three small essays. There is also a very interesting diary of him, of his discussions with wisdom. When the wisdom Sophia, the whole discussion actually is in French, yeah, it's very typical for that time. And divine wisdom also tells him, today is raining, for example, you have to be careful not to get cold, yeah? And sign Sophie. So you have this kind of very intimate relationship, a relationship of mutuality between the philosopher and the wisdom. I think that is a model, and I will try to show it. It is a model for Kojèvian figure of mutual recognition or desire of desire. Yeah? So not only Sophia is recognized through the love of philosopher, but philosopher is also recognized because Sophia loves him. Of course, Kojève was often compared to Hegel and Marx especially, in terms of this figure of struggle for recognition. Indeed, universal history was seen by both Hegel and Marx from the perspective of slave and not perspective of the master. And this figure of recognition is actually emerged in the first time in Hegel, and then it's repeated and repeated in Marx and Kojève. as a kind of primary scene of the birth of history and birth of self-consciousness. So to understand how the history ends, we have to understand how history begins. And the history begins in this moment as two self-consciousness meet. And at the moment of this first meeting, Hegel writes, they can only kill each other because every self-conscious believes that the whole world belongs to it. Yeah? So if I meet another self-consciousness, I have to destroy it. And so the possibilities are only three. One possibility, one wins and the other, or maybe two, yeah? In fact. One can win, one can lose and die, but one can lose and survive. So if one loses and survives, then one begins to work for the winner. So we begin the working process. So that is the moment where the problematics of Hegelian absolute spirit and a Marxian concept of work actually originate. So at the moment I begin to work for somebody else, I begin to work to satisfy not my desires, but the desires of the other. And by satisfying the desires of the other, I begin to manipulate them. I begin to create for the other like a prison, in which the other is imprisoned together with his or her desires. So at the end of history, we are confronted with the total victory of the slave, of the total victory of the worker. Yeah, because the worker is somebody who changed the universe, changed the society, changed the material world. And through this change and through this work, through this activity of negation and transformation of reality, puts actually master in a position of complete dependency. The socialist workers' revolution for Marx is only a formal political confirmation of this process of the factual that ends with the factual victory of the worker class even before the socialist revolution actually takes place. For Kojève also, the struggle for recognition of desire remains throughout the only motor of history. But he does not believe in the possibility of transforming the world by work. Actually, he believes only in war and revolution, in direct violence. That is why for Kojève the end of history manifests itself in a paradoxical character of modern revolutions. From the French to the Russian Revolution, the revolutionary people, he says, begin the mortal combat against the masters and win. But after having won the struggle, they go back to work, which is paradoxical. If you look at the whole history of mankind before French Revolution or Soviet Revolution, you never had this phenomena that the winner begins to work. So that going back to work means for Kojève that the winner is already satisfied. He has no desires anymore that would remain unsatisfied and lead him into further battles or into the position of the master. So for Kojève, the emergence of this figure of the armed worker marks the end of history. The citizen of the modern post-revolutionary state is a master and a slave at the same time. It's a double figure. The state itself has become, in Kojèvian terms, universal and homogeneous. Emergence of this kind of state that fully satisfies its citizens makes any desire for recognition and therefore any history that is driven by this desire impossible because this desire is now fully satisfied. So the history of man ends and the human beings return to the original prehistorical animal conditions, to animal unhistorical desires. The post-historical condition is this return to original animality, to socially guaranteed consumption as a unique remaining goal of the human existence. So for Kojève, French Revolution opened the way for the society of consumption, where the satisfaction of the bodily needs, basically it's hunger or sex, are guaranteed by the state order, and at the same time, all our desires are reduced for desires that are dictated by our animal existence. So the post-historical condition is at the same time a biopolitical, as we are now trained to say, mode of existence. Yeah, not accidentally Foucault and especially Agamben start the discourse about biopolitical nature of contemporary states with Kojève, with this figure of return to the human animality, yeah, as a main form of contemporary existence. Now, Maria already mentioned that our 2 days reception of Kojève is very much influenced by Francis Fukuyama essays about the end of history that emerged after the end of communism in the European East, and what was regarded at that time the final success of the Western mood of democracy and neoliberal capitalism. I can easily prove that by quotations, but let me say at the moment only that Kojève is very far away from this concept of the end of history. Because at the end of history, he sees a homogeneous and universal state. And that is something that we don't have. What we have today is a combination of the liberal market economy, globalized liberal market economy, and local political powers. The disbalance between globalized economy and localized politics is actually the reason for most of the plagues that we have. Yeah, impossibility of regulation of the markets, impossibility of democratic definition and managing of economy, dependence of the state from the investments from abroad, and so on, and so on, and so on. So what actually Kojève had in mind is the establishment of universal and homogeneous state that would be able to regulate the economy. He was a typical regulator. He was absolutely not a liberal thinker in this in economical terms. And of course, that's why he tried to create a European Union as a tool to control markets inside Europe. And of course, it didn't happen, because in Europe we have the same problem as we have everywhere, right? A universal problem. So we have euro, we have economy, we have all that. We don't have political, democratically legitimized political institution that would be able to control this development. So this disbalance between politics and markets is precisely what should be come to the end at the end of history. And the end of history in this sense begins for Kojève with French Revolution. The next step for him is the Soviet Revolution. The next step is the Chinese Revolution, and so on and so on. So he believes in the slow spread of the end of the history through the world and expansion of the concept of universal homogeneous state on the whole globe. So political globalization and not economical globalization. That is what is basically political philosophy of Kojève. I go back to that. If if I will be asked to do so, yeah, if we should bring me back. But now I would like to move forward, speaking about the role of Kojève himself. So how he understood his function as intellectual in the post-historical world. As I said, philosopher is moved by desire, by his desire for Sophia. But what does it mean, the end of history for a philosopher? It means that his desire is satisfied. And if love is satisfied, there is no love anymore. If desire is satisfied, there is no desire anymore. So what unites Kojève with surrealists, and at the same time divides him from the surrealists. He was mostly popular inside the surrealist circle of surrealist writers and surrealist philosophers and philosophers associated with the surrealist movement. And we know this formula by Breton, l'amour fou and infini. So for Breton, true surrealist desire should be infinite desire. What's very characteristic for Kojève is that he doesn't believe in the infinity of desire. He thinks that desire can be satisfied. Yeah? And at the moment the desire is satisfied, you are confronted with the day after. And it is the day after that is actual field of his interest, the post-historical work, yeah? The interest and investigation. So what does it mean, this day after? This day after means precisely that I do not have any desire anymore that would bring me outside of the existing mode of the factual mode of existence. And that is why he says that the satisfied love or satisfied desire is the end of negation. It is the end of negation of the world as it is. So we actually begin to exist, as I said, in an animal mode of existence after our human desires are already satisfied. And he really differentiate between animal desire, and animal desire is desire that destroys the object of desire. He always says, if I'm thirsty or have hunger, I drink water and there is no water anymore, yeah? Or I eat broad and there's no broad. But if I want the recognition of the other, I have to keep this other, yeah? I cannot destroy it and I have no desire to destroy it. So there is two types of desire. One desire is desire of something, which is the animal desire, and the other desire is desire of desire. That is very famous formulation that is taken over by Lacan, yeah, in the first place. This desire of desire of the other, is precisely what is anthropogenic machine, as Kojève says, and I really recommend you to read small book of Agamben by Agamben on this anthropogenic machine under the title The Open, which is very ingenious actually, and productive rereading of Kojève. So this desire of desire anthropogenic machine is precisely what directs me towards the other, but at the same time brings it to keep this other in place, to be able to be loved and desired by this other. So in a very strange way, if the conflict of Marxist conflict is a conflict, I don't know, of classes, yeah? When one class ultimately destroys the other class, the conflict that is on the mind of Kojève is a conflict of gender, yes, a gender conflict. Yeah? So I am in a conflict, but not in a conflict that brings me to the idea of annihilation of the opposite gender, yeah? As I would like to destroy the opposite class. This figure of desire became, as I said, very popular, very influential through Lacan and also Bataille. It's very interesting that this formula of desire brought a new translation of Kojève's text into German. Who knows German? Kojève translates into desire Hegelian Begierde. But this Begierde, Hegelian Begierde, has nothing to do with desire of desire, so it is translated back into the German by a specifically invented term, das Begehren, yeah, that never existed in German language before. So you have this kind of new homogeneous universal state at the end of the love story, yeah. So history is a great love story. At the end of this love story, you have the marriage without love, so to say. You have society of love that is at the same time society without love. A kind of very strange configuration that brings you to keep the other in place, yeah? But at the same time, always coming back in a attempt to be recognized by him or her again and again. Yeah? So there is a moment of repetition, yeah, that constitutes actually post-historical condition. Post-historical condition is not a condition of change. It's not a revolution. It's not a break. But it's a history of repetition. It's permanent work of repetition and permanent work of rejuvenation, permanent work, and so on and so on. So that is a point where the work of repetition begins to be central for the thinking of Kojève. And he speaks about work of repetition in two ways. Thinking that this work of repetition took two directions in European history. One is the Americanization of Europe. And Americanization of Europe is simply turning Europe into the animal existence, is an animal existence beyond any anthropogenic desire. The second possibility, which is much better, is a possibility that opens the postmodern or post-historical society by Japan. And so he speaks about Japanization of European culture as opposite to its Americanization. And Japanization of the European culture is precisely the ability to keep the form, to keep the form, to keep the institution in place, to work on this institution, to work as a form of life beyond the historical necessity. In this sense, he says that the majority of the people in post-historical condition tend to forget everything. They tend to forget history. Yeah? We tend to forget history. The post-historical condition is a huge wave of oblivion. Yeah? But there are people who are able to defend themselves against this wave of oblivion. And that is a sage. Yeah? So, the intellectual in a post-historical condition is not a philosopher striving for the future, yeah? And looking for overcoming the existing society. The sage, intellectual as sage, is somebody that keeps the form against everything that destroys it, that is able to reproduce, yeah, to reproduce and to go further and further and further in this process of reproduction. In a certain way that reminds me of a very famous McLuhan's formulation that the human beings are sexual organs of machine. Yeah? So for Kojève, humans are sexual organ of Hegelian philosophy. Yeah? The humans should remember Hegel. Yeah? Remember Hegel and repeat Hegel. Remember Hegel and repeat Hegel. Remember Hegel and repeat Hegel. And then they will work against this wave of oblivion, of falling back into the animal prehistoric condition. Now I would argue, and you will see when you go to even when you go to the exhibition, I will argue that this photography is such a permanent self-training, is non-forgetting, yeah, in a kind of a resistance, obstinate resistance to this wave of post-historical oblivion. In a very telling way, any photography is a work of repetition, and any photography is a work of reproduction. As I said already, two famous philosophers, two famous phenomenologists were his students. Both of them were Merleau-Ponty and Lacan. Both of them said that human eyes and human gaze are never active. They are never subjective. They are never active in determining and controlling the field of vision. Lacan explicitly compares human eyes with a camera and with a film, saying that the objects themselves actually bring themselves to us, yeah, and leave a trace on our eyes, like they leave a trace on the film. So things are active, we are passive. It's not like we are going through the world and appropriating it, but we let this world leave its traces in our imagination, our eyes, in our gaze. In this sense, Lacan speaks about non-subjective, free-floating gaze. It is a gaze that is given to us by the things. And he also speaks with Merleau-Ponty about the fact that optic is also haptic. So in a certain way, things touch us, and they touch our eyes, yeah, through the light, and that is why we can see. We can see not because we have vision. We can see because we have this receptivity towards the touch of the things. Okay, so that is precisely the feelings that you have if you look at the photographs by Kojève. You have a feeling that of somebody who makes himself a place for situating, territorializing this kind of free-floating gaze, yeah, that brings to him and touches him through the monuments of the past in the first place. Yeah? So he is obstinate in his desire not to go further, but to be touched by the same. And that is precisely this will to reproduction or repetition that is actually so fascinating in this project. I must say that as I looked at this archive before I called Maria, I thought, okay, so, you know, people traveling, they take photographs, you know, that's something everybody does, yeah? And maybe I can find something interesting, yeah? It could be shown, it could be published. And then I see 5,500 photographs. subjected to very clear-cut, very definite system of rules, that a project that is realized almost 10 years, yeah, in a very systematic way, never going left and right, never changing its direction, always repeating the same fundamental structure, always making the same choice, always organizing the material in the same way. So an obstinate, systematic artistic project made for oneself, because he never tried and he never wanted to exhibit it. But projects that immediately reminded me, I said that already, I wrote that, of Andy Warhol, reminded me of American minimalists like Donald Judd and so on. So if you look at the late 50s and 60s, you find these figures of the artists that submitted and subjected themselves to long-term projects and really pull them through years and decades. Yeah? That is something that people today don't do mostly. Yeah? The artists go from project to project. Yeah? You don't have this kind of lifetime project. So to look at this lifetime project of post-historical existence, as Kojève understood it, so submitting himself in terms of Japanization, yeah, to looking for a pure form of the outside world, it was absolutely fascinating. At the same time, it was also fascinating because the aesthetics of the images at the same time, yeah, seemed to me to be extremely contemporary. Extremely contemporary simply because contemporary arts very, very much fixed on documentary and looking like documentary. It can be a very individual choice, it can be a very individual style, but it's kind of at the same time, artists care about certain kind of coincidence between their specific subjective gaze and what they experience as objectifying, objective, neutral gaze of the camera, of the mass media. And in this sense, it's interesting that parallel to his own photographs, Kojève collected more than 10,000 postcards that more or less represent the same monuments he then photographed himself. So he always tried to find a correlation between his individual gaze and the gaze of society he was living in. Through Hegelian project, yeah, because Hegelian project is a project precisely directed toward a certain kind of unity, yeah, between individual gaze and, I don't know, absolute spirit, yeah, or public gaze. And now to finish this presentation, I make maybe one remark concerning the eternal question of criticality. Is art of Kojève critical? Yeah? And if yes, in what sense? Now, if we go deep enough in the problem of criticality, yeah, what does it mean to be critical? How it is possible to be critical toward one's own time does not mean to take this and one and this and the other position of contestation that is already inscribed inside this time. Yeah? Because of course, in every time we are living, there are different parties, different opinions, conflicts, and so on and so on. So we only can take sides. Yeah? It is a certain kind of criticism, and it is a certain kind of contestation. But it seems to me it's not really a radical kind of contestation. The radical kind of contestation is a suspension of belief in our time altogether. Yeah? It's not like we are immersed in our time with a certain kind of specific attitude. But actually the ability to to be critical toward one's own time is the ability to refer to history. So if we refer to history, we know that our time is one time among many others. Yeah? Is it historical? Is it post-historical? It is a time that at certain period of time disappears. Yeah? What history tells us is that everything is finite, everything is mortal, everything is disappearing at a certain point in time. There is no, and Kojève was very much an atheist. He didn't believe, and he wrote that time and again, he didn't believe in anything infinite, he didn't believe in anything transcending, he didn't believe in anything that goes beyond time. So this feeling that our time is as precarious, as transient, as unstable, as dying as any other time, is precisely what gives us the ability not to be completely overwhelmed by it, to take a distance to it, to judge it from a certain position of the outside, to be contemporary. Contemporary means to be with time. It doesn't mean to be in time. It means to be with time, but a certain distance from time. And I think that is precisely the feeling of contemporaneity that does not coincide with immersion in a moment that that Kojève's images communicate to their spectator. And that's what I want to say.
It has been a part of Bach's narrative that we always wanted to see art as a very possibility to imagine things otherwise. This I have been repeating of the course of last 20 years in every single text when I would be articulated what for me good artistic practice is. It's attempts to imagine things otherwise. Now, Kojève's project threw me into crisis in that respect, because if I translate it in very simple terms into practice of an art institution, I would need to give up hoping that art can imagine things otherwise, and in sync with Kojève think, well, there is an ideal imagination of the world out there, born out of French Revolution, and our role probably is through action implement that ideal. Am I right? Am I wrong? Do I have reasons to be in crisis believing art should be imagining things otherwise?
Well, I think that everything goes in waves, and you know, if you speak about thinking about things different way and imagining them otherwise, and so on, still I have a question how, yeah? Because think about things in different way presupposes a certain way. Yeah, think about things in different way, a certain kind of difference. It seems to me that this kind of difference dominated European thinking, left thinking for many decades. It is a certain kind of French paradigm. Yeah? Okay. This certain kind of French paradigm was born very explicitly at the end of the 50s and 60s and during the 60s and culminates 68 years, the year of death of Kojève. Speaking favorably about everything that is anti-state, that is anti-authoritarian, everything that flows, everything that goes beyond borders, everything that freely circulates, everything that deviates, everything that negates, and so on and so on. after certain period of time, if we ask ourselves, what is this thing that does all that? There's only one answer, it's financial capital. Yeah? Simply, simple answer. It is the only signifier, yeah, it is the only signified of these all floating signifiers. And indeed, France at the beginning of 60s was authoritarian, bureaucratic, well-regulated state that really absolutely went on the nerves of the citizens, and especially Parisian intellectuals. So they wanted to communicate, they wanted to globalize themselves, and so on and so on. But that is precisely what the capital is. The capital financial markets is everything that undermines all the borders, that creates destructive creation and creative destruction, yeah, that change our professions, our identities, that makes everything to flow, and so on. If you look now at the, not at the ideal, yeah, but the factual projects of the left, yeah, maybe it's my impression from America, where I think it's very clear, cut, yeah, difference in the presidential campaign. The left is on the side of the state and regulation, yeah, and the right is for free floating and free flow, yeah. And I tell you, sitting in front of American TV, and I was fascinated by American discussions recently, and listening to Santorum, for example, I had a feeling reading Foucault together with my students, yeah? You have everything, yeah? State-regulated domination by education, exclusion of so-called not educated people, imposing of certain concepts of rationality that are actually, and so on and so on and so on. And this, we should be set free, set free, set free, set free, set free. Actually, this kind of experience and this kind of reappropriation of this, you know, rhetorics of flow and change and all of that, that began already with Reagan, yeah, if you follow the story. But now it's like quite clear cut. So, I don't know what happened before, I don't know what happened after that, yeah? But at the moment we are in, yeah, my sensibility tells me that left position is position of Kojève. And traditional post-Foucauldian, you know, I don't know, delusion flow is actually intellectual superstructure at the basis of the international financial capital, to speak in a Marxist terms. Yeah? But I don't know, it's my appreciation, it's how I look at it. Yeah, it can be different opinions. It's too hot, I think.
It's coming, the mic's coming.
Just one quick thing. For me, like everything said, you know, the after history thing is still very much Western to my mind in a way. I was wondering how would you update the whole like thing, considering, you know, what's going on now? Economically, the brick, talkie-walkie, but other things as well, kind of under that.
Yeah, Western, but yeah. I mean, I don't see at the moment no movement outside Western Europe and Western world that would tell us, maybe with the exception of Iran, yeah, and also like half-half, yeah, that would tell us we don't want to the Western way. Yeah. So what people actually want, they want to be recognized by the Western world on the same terms and in the same way Westerners are recognized here, yeah? And it is precisely the station that Kojève describes, yeah? So we have this kind of movement of recognition, requirement of recognition, requirement of global citizenship, requirement of a certain kind of homogeneity and universality of economic and social rules, and so on and so on, all over the world. To say it is not Eurocentric, it is not Western-centric, I don't know what does it mean, yeah? In any case, the Western already lost its initial flair, yeah, because it's quite clear Western economies go down. And the point is not, is it Western or Eastern? The point is, does it stay still in a tradition of a certain figure of homogeneous universal state, guarantees certain rights, guarantees certain ideals, or not? Yeah? It seems to me that the majority of people on the world want that, and want to be recognized in this term. Not all of them, but big majority.
You mentioned that this was a very personal project for Kojève, i.e. that he didn't want to necessarily exhibit it. Can you tell us a bit about how these objects were collated or systematized by Kojève after the taking of them? So can you talk about how the archiving of these objects maybe tells us something about the project as well?
Yes, I think so, yeah. Of course, for some practical reasons, we had limited possibilities to map the archive on the exhibition. The archive, the visual archive, no. Visual archive itself consists of two parts. One part are his images, his photographs. All of them are on slides. None of them is printed out. And all of them are separated and put into like big maps and big books, yeah, in a very conventional way. Well organized, well ordered, according to countries and according to individual travels into these countries. In this sense, the exhibition maps kind of the order of the original archive, because photographs are shown as projections, and it's how they are, yeah, slides, and according to the travels. Yeah, the travels are separated, the structure kind of repeats the structure of the catalog and presentation inside. Of course, you have the more than 5,000 slides, and here we had only 400, but the structure is kept. If we look at the collection of postcards, it consists of two parts. One part monuments, one part works of art. It's quite clear what his taste was. He was interested in medieval art and medieval monuments and modernist art of the 20th century. So it's basic two parts of the postcard collection. We reproduced that too. So if you look at the how the structures are structured according to this duality, yeah, and it is also kind of mapping. What we could not keep is the orderly way of the presentation, because all the postcards are in boxes. If you sit alone, you can go one after another. Of course, I created a mess out of them, and they are in original form. They are not messy. That is kind of shift, yeah. In original way, they are very orderly, organized, but they are organized more or less, or maybe even totally, according to the structures that we reproduced on the tables. So individual countries and combination of medieval monuments and modernist works. So more or less.
Are there more questions?
Yes, I wanted to ask you if I understood correctly what you were, or something of what you were saying about post-history being a condition of repetition, and that photography in some way is a resistance to that repetition. I wonder if you could say something about the incredible explosion of images now on the web, and how it seems to me that some of this imagery and all the photographs that people put up about their own lives can also lead to a kind of oblivion.
Yeah, it is of course the case, but well, what he does, he creates his own project, he creates his own archive according to his own insistence on repetition and reproduction. So it is a counter project to this website Messiah, and this kind of resistance and this kind of strategy is also open today. I do not believe that things are changing in this substantial way, that if somewhere on the website and the internet there is a kind of free-floating, realm of images, we are necessarily obliged to reproduce it in our own mind. Yeah? We can't do that. Maybe it's interesting. But we can also try to reorganize it in a way that corresponds our own inner system of thinking and inner regime of viewing. Yeah? So it's always possible. It's not something that is automatically submit our own imagination to this kind of general, flow of science. There's no compulsion.
Is there another question? If not, can I thank you, Boris, for this introduction to the exhibition. As we're going to move there, I hope you're joining us for the drinks there. If you go to visit the exhibition, I guarantee there's extremely pleasant condition there. In case you decide not to be with artworks and join us for drinks, it's gonna be damn hot upstairs. So maybe you can figure out rhythm between work of art and those informal conversation through which we can continue discussing these issues. Thank you again for coming here, and thanks so much, Boris, for your talk.